Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon if you're not in California. Thanks for coming to the boot camp or to the seminar, webcast this morning. Today we're going to talk about servicing with our Executive Vice President, Ingrid Maddox. And but before we get started, I just wanted to alert you to one more time to the boot camp that we're having in San Francisco on July 17th, 18th, and 19th. At the DoubleTree Hilton Hotel at the airport. Very convenient if you're flying in. Please go to notemogul.com and take a look at the event. You can see the what's going to be covered. It'll be well worth your while. And the nice thing about our boot camp is that we're not going to try to sell you anything there. And whatever you pay for the boot camp, you can use as a credit toward purchasing a note. So actually the event is free if you do buy a note. And I hope that everybody that attends does get into this business because it is a wonderful business. So if San Francisco is not your ballywag and you don't have the time or it's too much of an effort to get to San Francisco, we are going to be in Houston in August, and we're going to be in Boston in October. So just go to notemogul.com, notemogul.com, and all the information is there. So thanks again for coming today, and we're going to talk about servicing, a very, very important part of this business. I'd like to introduce you to Ingrid Maddox. For those of you that don't know her, it is our Executive Vice President in charge of servicing, a very long 20-year history of servicing industry. She worked for a major lender in state of Nevada. She runs our Carson City office and is very, very experienced and knowledgeable about the servicing business, which is a very highly regulated and compliance important industry. And we don't want you to get in any trouble when you're doing servicing, and therefore I think it's a very important day when we can get Ingrid on to kind of give you her background information that is very important to this industry. So in order to just get started, first, Ingrid, thanks for making time for us today. And secondly, just to get the ball rolling, can you just, there are some people on here that don't own a note yet and may not be familiar with all the esoteric terms in the esoteric industry that we're in. And we have a tendency sometimes to talk in terms that other people that aren't in the industry may not know what we're talking about. So can you just explain, first of all, what is actually servicing all about? What is servicing? And then take it a step further and go through what you do and how you would recommend that people that are buying notes run their servicing department. So take it away.
Okay, servicing is the administration part of collecting payments, dealing with escrow accounts, handling compliance issues, dealing with customers. There's so many different facets of servicing and making sure that you handle everything according to regulations from many different agencies, such as the Federal Reserve Board, the Federal Housing Administration, the Consumer Federal Protection Bureau, going through all of RESPA and TILA guidelines. There's so many regulations out there that you need to make sure that you are compliant and you keep up on all of these regulations because they do change constantly. Some of like the Consumer Federal Protection Bureau, for example, they monitor not only big banks, they now are regulated over all of servicing people, regardless of if you have one note or 10,000 notes. the CFPB can come in and audit you. If you ever want to have an interesting read, I would suggest going to their website. Their examination manual is 924 pages alone. So that's some of the things that you need to watch out for when you are doing your own servicing, is just making sure that you are on top of all the regulations that are out there.
Can you mentioned a couple of things, and one would be escrow. When you said when you're collecting escrow, would you explain to the audience just what you mean by when you're collecting escrow?
Yes. When you have a first mortgage, you typically have taxes and insurance that are included in the payment. When you have those funds come into your account, they have to be separated and put into a separate account to be managed for when an escrow analysis is done on an annual basis. That's when you pay your hazard insurance and your taxes out of that account. It cannot be commingled with your own personal account. Any interest that is collected off that account does have to be given back to your borrower, your consumer. So it is a very regulated part of the collecting payments on a first mortgage.
So let's just take an example, and let's say that Mark here buys a note that is escrow. Let's say he buys a performing first or performing second, but typically a performing first, and that the taxes and the insurance are impounded when he buys the note. What is Mark's requirement now? He owns one note. Is he going to be responsible for having the escrowed account and having a trust account and all that, and be subject to somebody coming in and saying, hey, examine this for me?
Oh, definitely. I mean, anyone who has a mortgage, period, and they're collecting impounds on that mortgage has to have followed by the regulations, which is having a separate account. You can be audited regardless of how many notes you have. So any of those that I mentioned, the Federal Reserve Board or Dodd-Frank, RESPA, any of the entities that I mentioned earlier can come in and say, I want to audit you for that one note. And if you are not compliant by protecting that person's, basically their money that's going to pay for their taxes and insurance, because if you don't pay it and their house burns down, you're the one that's liable. Or if their taxes go delinquent and they end up having a lien against their home, you are the one that's liable. So you do have to make sure that you are following all the regulations, guidelines, and putting that money into a separate account so that you're protecting that consumer. Okay.
Another thing that you mentioned when you were talking about it, the servicing, there's also specialty servicing. That's a term that we hear. What exactly is specialty servicing, and is that also something that the note holder or note owner needs to know about?
Specialty servicing in regards to having additional coverage?
As relating to going, let's say that a note goes delinquent, and a specialty servicing is now all of a sudden, not only are you a servicer, you are a debt collector. So
yes, specialty servicing, you do have to abide by certain different practices when a loan does go delinquent. You have to make so many phone calls to a borrower, but you also have to abide by debt collecting rules and regulations at that point. You have to make sure that you can call up to 3 times in one day, that type of thing. But as soon as a loan goes delinquent, you are supposed to make a phone call to a borrower within 30 days. You're supposed to send them certain letters out in certain time periods. You do have to follow up with that borrower, give them certain notices at certain time frames. So I think it's on the 15th, the 30th, the 45th day. Then you have 60 days. Then you have 90 days. And typically at that point, you can start the foreclosure process, which the big banks do. We're a little bit different in the fact that we continue to go and try and help that borrower. We work with them to try to modify their first mortgages, their second. We work with them to modify the second mortgage. We do forbearance agreements, though. We don't modify our loans. That actually helps it to where if they ever do go delinquent on their loan, that we can turn around and we can do a new forbearance agreement. We don't have to stay with a modification. We can keep going back and working with that borrower. But yes, there are definitely different requirements for anyone who does go delinquent. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, they're regulated to where they only can do certain things on their loans because it is government money, where we are a little different, where we can work with the borrower more to put them into a program that works better for them.
Okay. So I know one of the big deals when we got into this business and you started developing our servicing service for us was policies and procedures that are absolutely required of a servicer. And again, there's no distinction made between a servicer servicing one account versus servicing 25,000 notes. Is there a difference in?
There is no difference. Sorry, the CFPB, they have 4 things that they come in and they monitor when
But let me interrupt you. You have been through several audits. So,
yes.
and if you are servicing a number of notes, there's no question you're going to be audited. Is that kind of a safe statement? So maybe not if you've got one, but if you're doing a number of them, you definitely are going to be audited at some point. So now I'm sorry, I go through those 4 topics again.
They come in first of all to see if you have a board of directors and management oversight to make sure that everyone is basically, the board is oversight over the managers and making sure that everything's in line. That's the first thing that they come in and look at. Second thing is your compliance program. They want to make sure that you have a compliance program, that you're staying within the compliance regulations, and making sure that you have things written, procedures, that you have a quality control program, that your information is protected from your borrowers, so no one can get into your computer or no one can walk in and see papers sitting around. They also have a consumer complaint, that you have a consumer complaint program in place. So if someone were to call in and they were complaining about something that you did, that you follow the regulations of how to handle that complaint. There are certain ways that you have to handle a complaint from a consumer. And then the last one is an independent audit. You have to have someone come in and independently audit you, as well as, so you can provide to them that says, I had myself audited, nothing went wrong through that audit, or something went wrong and I corrected it. But you have to have all those things in place so that when the CFPB comes in, or any kind of regulatory agency comes in to audit you, they can see that you have those 4 things in place. Okay.
And so one thing you mentioned just then that a lot of people probably aren't aware of, and that is that these things, it doesn't matter, again, whether you have 1 note, 2 notes, 25 notes, or 10,000 notes that you're servicing, you are required to follow these. The guidelines is not the right word because they are regulated. They are regulations. They are not guidelines. And if you don't, the consequences can be enormous. So for example, we know that one major servicer just in the last 6 months was fined $35 million because a paper with somebody's social security number was left out where somebody else could see it. Not that anybody did see it or that there was anything done with it, but it was laying out there in plain view. So just the fact that you may have a home office and you have papers that are not secure, or your computer system is not secure, an excuse that I only have one note is not sufficient. It's not satisfactory. You're going to get creamed, and it's going to be very, very expensive. So, so it's important that people have a, quote, compliance officer, but more important, well, as equally important is they have somebody come in that's an independent auditor to look at their procedures and make sure that, number one, they're all written down. Number two, that they're being followed. So how often do you think somebody with less than 10 notes, for example, should have a compliance officer come in so that they can prove, or an independent compliance auditor come in to make sure that they're doing things right?
Well, some agencies, depending on how many notes you have, I would say probably at least once a year, you want to make sure that you're in compliance. And I know that can be costly to get an independent auditor. However, it will protect you in the long run.
Well, and if they come in and you don't have one, then you violated the regulation, correct?
Yes.
All right. So, I mean, it's not, hey, it'd be a good idea to have a auditor come in. It's required. And I think a lot of people don't realize that they're sitting back collecting money each month, happy that it's coming in on time. They may be paying off the taxes and the insurance, but they really don't know, because they haven't studied, what regulations they're violating. And that's a big one, that they have not had an independent auditor come in on a regular basis and audit their file. Now, that almost makes it, if you have one note that's paying you $500 a month, $6,000 a year, people would tend to ignore the regulation that they needed to have an independent audit that was going to cost them $3,000.
Right.
But we just want to make people aware of what's out there and what can happen to them, and then that they have to make that decision of whether or not they think they have the chance of getting the Consumer Finance Protection Board in, or whoever to come in and that would come in and investigate them. But one thing is that it may only take one phone call from the borrower if the borrower is agitated or thinks they can, they're at a cocktail party and somebody tells them, that servicer is required to do X, and they make a call and say, my servicer isn't doing X. And that could trigger, just something that simple could trigger somebody coming in to investigate whether you're doing it or not. So can you give us an idea of our policy and procedure manual? How big is it? What does it include?
It includes everything from when we open the mail to how we collect a payment, how we distribute our escrows, how we analyze escrows. I mean, it's a very big manual. Yeah. Because we have to make sure that we're covering ourselves, and make sure that we're abiding by what the compliance regulations are.
Yeah, and we know we're going to be audited. It's not something that, well, we hope they never show up. We know they're coming at some point, and when they do, we want to be comfortable that, and that's really another reason for the independent auditor, is the independent auditor can come in. They can point out things that you may not be doing quite right or quite satisfactory, that you can correct before you get audited by one of the government agencies who at some point are going to be there. When you have a number of things that you're servicing, the more you do, the more visible you get, the more likely they are to show up. And the independent auditor can prepare you for that and say, hey, you need better change this, because that'll save you a ton of money if they do come in and find it wrong. So a policy and procedure manual is very, very important, where they have one note or 25,000 notes, and you ought to have somebody checking that to make sure that you are in compliance. So how would somebody go about finding one of these agency or independent person to come in and?
Well, you can pretty much Google anything nowadays, but if you were just to go and look up, you can look up by CFPB approved auditors.
Okay.
Type of thing, or any kind of servicing auditor type. I mean, Googling anybody in your area, because you're going to have to find someone local to come in. You may not, I mean, if you're in a smaller place, you may have to go and find someone who's not local and have them come in. But I do strongly suggest it. The other thing that I don't know if we mentioned is the fact that, we are licensed in all the states. And that is a big thing right now. They are cracking down on people who are not licensed in licensed in the state they're doing business in. So making sure that you have your license to service in the areas that you have those notes is very important and crucial to your business. Because if they do find you that you are not licensed, they potentially could take that note away from you, and there goes your income. So
okay, and it's not. Yeah, I think. If you are the note owner, you probably can get by with doing the servicing yourself. But if you're doing it for somebody else, you definitely would need to have a license. And second to that is that there are some states who are being very aggressive on determining whether you're licensed or not by going through and looking at independent, or let's say private investors' names. Like they come in and look for Ingrid Maddox and see if Ingrid Maddox owned a note and whether they could correspond Ingrid Maddox owning a note to Ingrid Maddox being licensed. And when they can't, now all of a sudden you're in violation. And there are several states, I think 18 of them now, that have a program to do that comparison, to go after people that aren't licensed. One thing that people that maybe on the webcast might not know is that a lot of what happened in this meltdown and a lot of things that really hurt the consumer and the borrower were servicer related. The servicers, because a lot of them are owned by the major banks. Like B of A has its own servicing department. It's not called BFA Servicing Department. So you would not as a consumer or a borrower know that B of A was actually collecting the account, but it's a B of A owned company. And there were so many shenanigans pulled on the by the servicers and transferring of servicers where the homeowner wasn't notified properly and their house went into foreclosure when they thought they were doing a modification, and servicer one was helping them do a modification, and it all of a sudden got transferred, and servicer two didn't know or said they didn't know that there was a modification going on and foreclosed on the property. And all of those things that happened to the consumer really added to putting these servicing laws and rules in place that make it pretty onerous for the private investor. But if you can satisfy them, but you need to be diligent and do so. So licensing is becoming a bigger and bigger issue every month, it seems like. And government, they never shrink. It continues to grow. The regulations are probably going to continue to increase. And if you are doing any servicing or debt collecting, just be very diligent in keeping abreast of the industry so that you know what's going on and what the regulations are. So is there anything else, Ingrid, that you think people need to know about the servicing part of it? And
I just strongly suggest reading the regulations. If you are going to service your own notes, that you need to go and make sure that you are educated and you know what you have to do to not get those potential huge fines. I mean, we have an individual that I know personally who had one note. She originally had a fine for almost, it was going to be $45,000, something like that. And that's a big fine when you have, just a few notes.
Yeah. Yeah. If you had a note for 30,000 and got fined 45, that's kind of, and that's typically what happens is it pretty much puts you out of business if you are a small investor, small being, let's say you have 3 notes or 5 notes, it just puts you out of business. And not many of us private investors can certainly afford $35 million.
Yeah.
That'd probably end it for most of us. So just be really aware of that, and be sure that you know what's going on, because ignorance is no excuse. They will not accept ignorance as an excuse. All right. Well, thank you, Ingrid. Anybody that has questions, please email them to us. Ingrid would be very, very happy to get back in touch with you via email or telephone to help you understand this servicing business. She is very, very astute on it. She's always up to date, knows exactly what's going on, is very strong on the compliance part of it, can help you out in that area. So please give us a call if you need to. And please keep in mind that the Note Mogul seminars are available, San Francisco in July, Houston in August, and Boston in October. Again, we sell nothing. We're not trying to sell you on coaching programs. We're trying to educate you. It's very intensive 3-day seminar that is all education, and you can use that money that you pay to come to the boot camp as a credit toward purchasing a note. So thank you. Look forward to seeing you next week. We were going to have an attorney, a foreclosure attorney on. Unfortunately, he had issues on the date, so he will be here on July 14th. He is a foreclosure attorney in judicial states, does a lot of our foreclosures in Florida, I think New York and New Jersey. Very, very knowledgeable man. And I'm hoping next week we can get on our custodian that keeps our files for us, stores our files and looks and has our files recorded and so on. Have them on to give you some idea about how to take care of your files as you grow. So be glad to cover that with you next week, and we look forward to seeing you. So Ingrid, thank you very, very much. I hope the fire doesn't get too close to you. Big fire up in the Sierras, and we'll see you later. Thanks, everybody.